Okay, well, we'll get started. As what was mentioned, my name is Erich Weber, and I work for the Ministry of Agriculture, Food, and Rural Affairs. I'm an accountant by trade. I'm a CPA, but I'm also a farmer, trying to take over the family farm, and also work at OMAFRA. So multiple hats I wear, but uh, as you say, no moss is growing underneath my feet, I guess. Tonight, we're going to get started, and as Lori mentioned, that we did have a more general starting a farm section. So please, if you haven't already, please watch or listen to that presentation when you have a second. I think there's some valuable stuff. But tonight session, we're going to focus more on the direct to the consumer or direct farm marketing, and we're going to break it out into two kind of main areas. First is, preparing to sell directly to the consumer. So we're going to talk about, the FBR program, more so whether or not what do you do if you haven't hit that $7,000 threshold. Also, we'll get into the premise ID section, food processing, how to get started, food incubators, and then we're going to get into the business of selling. So how do you market your different record keeping requirements and so on and so forth. And then at the end, we'll have time, hopefully some time for questions. If not, or if you have a burning question, please, as was mentioned earlier, please put that in your in the chat, and we'll get that. Lori or Emily will chime in and ask that question, or at the end of the session. Or if you don't feel comfortable, or you are watching this at a later time, please feel free to reach out directly to myself. My contact information is at the end of this slides, but then also too, you can always reach out to Lori and Emily at Grey Egg Services, and they can either get you to the right spot or they can direct you to me, whichever the question is. So we'll get started. But before, just want to mention that so the information you're going to see tonight is going to be more so background information on your different options on starting a farm business. Before you do anything, please reach out to your accountants, your lawyers, your advisors, lenders, and get some advice through them, as they will be able to hold your hand and walk you through the different hurdles or procedures that you may have to deal with. So just keep that in mind. And as I mentioned earlier, you all should have received a copy of the first night's presentation on more of the general aspects of starting a farm business. These are kind of the topics that we focused on. And again, if you have any questions about that, you can ask them tonight, or you can ask them whenever, reaching out to Lori or Emily or myself. So we're going to get started with preparing to start your direct-to-consumer business. So if you have watched the first general food processing, starting a farm business in Ontario, we do talk about the farm business registration program. But tonight, I just want to talk to you more about, what happens since you might be starting from scratch. What happens in the situation where you may not hit that threshold of $7,000 of gross farm revenues. As you all, just a quick summary that if you have grossed more than $7,000 of farm revenues, you are legally required to register your farm business. But in the case that you aren't, and you've already bought a property, there are certain programs out there that you may not be able to apply for until you have that FBR number. So more of a chicken and an egg type scenario, which comes first. So there are processes in place for you to get an FBR number without having the full having met the $7,000 worth of gross farm revenues. First off, you have to talk to AgriCorp. That's the Crown Corporation that works with OMAFRA on creating the farm business registration program. We'll get talking about what the plan should look like in a second, but if you, for religious reasons, do object to registering with the farm business registration program, you do have to submit an appeal through the Agriculture, Food, and Rural Affairs Appeal Tribunal. And you can call them with the number on your screen there. It's possible but again, you're going through an appeal, so it could be quite difficult to obtain that. But it is certainly an option if that's a situation that you're in. Otherwise, if you're just, you don't object to registering your farm business, but you just haven't met that $7,000 threshold, as I mentioned earlier, that you will need to submit a plan. Let AgriCorps know that you haven't met that $7,000, and then B, submit a plan. And so your plan is going to look like more of a explaining the situation of why haven't you met your this threshold, and can be as simple as, well, we just bought the farm in January of 2023, and we couldn't get a crop in the ground because it's dead of winter. It's pretty difficult to do that, because as just a quick aside, because if you don't have a farm business registration number, you won't be able to participate in the farm property tax class program, which allows you to get 25%, or allows you to pay 25% of the residential tax rate on your farm. So it can be significant savings. So again, you want to explain your reason, outline how you plan on obtaining that $7,000 gross farm revenue. So that can be as simple as, we're planning on growing a crop, start planting in April, and we're planning on planting so many acres, and we're planning on selling it through, as you say, in this case, on-farm store, or through a farmer's market, or through a CSA type scenario. And then you also have to provide some form of a timeline as well to outline. So as you say, are you going to be able to do this within a year, 6 months, a year and a half? The shorter period of time that you can hit that threshold is the better. But ultimately, AgriCorps will receive that plan, then they'll review it, and then if they have any questions, they'll reach out to you, or they'll just approve it, and then you'll get your farm business registration number. But before you start developing a plan and whatnot, please contact AgriCorps. The telephone number is on your screen there, and they'll be able to walk you through that whole process and give you the timelines from their perspective on how quick they can process your plan and whatnot. So switching gears, premise ID, or premise identification number. So this is a program that's really come out in the last, I would say, 10 years, less than 10 years. And the whole idea of the premise ID, identification number, or PID, if you want to call it that, is to assign a unique number to parcels of land. And again, the idea is to deal with traceability programs. So if a situation happens on a certain parcel of land, they'll be able to ultimately find out where that has happened, quarantine it, or be able to trace that back and find out what all happened. And this program is meant for land parcels that are involved in growing or raising agriculture products or food processing. So depending on your scenario, your situation, if you're going to have any sort of food processing, you'll definitely have to have a premise ID number. So as I mentioned, main idea is to be used in traceability systems. But again, certain crops and livestock will have different are at different stages in the traceability world. I know we talked about pigs last week, but I know pigs are very big into the pig sector is very keen on traceability. If you're looking at crops, your edible bean crops are very big in the traceability system as well, but then also food processing, because ultimately if something were to happen, they want to be able to follow that back and figure out where the issue is. So when it comes to your premise ID number, it is linked to your municipal roll number. So that's if you get your tax bill, it's that very long, I think it's 16-digit number at the top of your bill, which hopefully is not your how much you owe, but just because it has a lot of digits and decimal points. So, and depending on your parcel of land, if you have, let's say, 50 acres and you get 3 tax bills, in theory, you're supposed to have 3 different premise ID numbers, because it's all tied. the number is tied directly to your roll number. So if you have a unique roll number for each parcel, in theory, you need to have a unique PIN number for each parcel. As I mentioned at the bottom there, depending on government programs that you may be applying for in terms of cost share, they will require you to have a premise ID number. So the Canadian Agriculture Partnership, which is just about to end shortly, they require, if you have any cost share programs to them, they will require a premise ID number as well as a farm business registration number. So it's good to have these numbers figured out sooner rather than later. So when it comes to cost, because let's be honest, we're all concerned about cost of these programs, there is no cost for you to register your premise ID number. You do need to have your municipal roll number when you go to register your property. There are ways for you to get around it, and I believe it's requiring you have to provide the coordinates of your property, so your latitude, longitude. But ideally, if you can get your municipal roll number, it makes your life a lot easier, makes their life a lot easier, and it's just a lot simpler. So if you can get your municipal roll number, that's your number one option. To obtain it, again, it's all through Agricorp as well, but it does have a unique website, the www.ontariopid.com /ENCA, or you can just call Agricorp and they will take the information over the phone and they'll process your premise ID registration. Okay. We'll focus on food processing. So depending on your operation will determine how much you want to be listening to this section. If you're on an operation that's just looking at selling crops like fruits and vegetables just directly, you know, like carrots, beans, without any processing, you probably don't need to worry about this. But again, if you are planning on doing any sort of food processing on the farm, as you say, doing any baked goods, if you're planning on, you know, if you're growing lots of tomatoes and you want to make your own salsa or tomato sauce or whatnot, this is the section you would need to pay attention. I will be honest that this is just a very high level review. If you are determined to go into the food processing section, please reach out to the contacts that we'll get talking about later on. More so the public health in your area. I'm not too sure if everybody's from Grey Bruce tonight or not, but I'll just speak in generalities that your public health authority is very key when it comes to any sort of on-farm food processing or any food handling of any sort. So just keep that in mind. That by no means am I going to say that I'm providing all the information. I'm giving you a good first step so that you can ask those key questions when you start talking to those key people. So as again, why do people get into food processing? Let's be honest, a jar of strawberry jam is you bring in more money from strawberry jam than you do of strawberries. Maybe not the most profitable, but that's a conversation we'll get into later on tonight. But let's be honest, it all depends on, you know, what's your customer base needs, as well as I mentioned earlier, your revenues should increase when you are doing that extra work, doing that extra processing. So as I mentioned, it can increase your revenues, but then costs and other requirements may also increase depending on your situation. And we'll get into the different aspects that you have to think about when you are looking at the food processing option. So first off, we're going to talk about everybody's favorite property taxes. So I'm quite sure if you own any property, any farmland, you ultimately do pay property taxes. As a farmer and you have a valid farm business registration number and you're participating in the farm tax class program, as I mentioned there, you only pay 25% of what the residential tax rate is for the land associated with the farm. So if your house and an acre, maybe acre and a half, that is still taxed at residential tax rate, but ultimately, just for, you know, general purposes, you might as well say the full property is at 25% of the residential tax rate. But when it comes to having any sort of specific building on your property that is specifically tied to any food processing, can change your how that parcel, that part of the land is viewed. So an example would be, as I said, if you decide to have a shed or a building on your property that takes up with the building, and then any sort of storage areas and whatnot, if it takes up an acre, you might as well be prepared that that building, if 100% of it's going to be used for processing food or handling food, is going to be taxed at a different rate, usually industrial, because food processing is um, business where you are transforming items. Even though when you think of industrial, you might think of, well, a steel plant, or a big manufacturing plant. But ultimately, when you look at MPAC rules, they will view any sort of processing, food processing, or that specific area as industrial. So, and may not be considered agriculture. So that will change your property taxes, and will increase your property tax rate. So just keep that in mind. And again, I just want to stress this enough. I don't know if I can do it, stress it enough, but again, it's only for the area that is associated to food processing. Or anything else that you're planning on doing. If you have an on-farm store, for instance, like again, a separate building that is, 100% or majority of it is used in, selling your farm produce or produce of your neighbors, that would fall into a category where it would not be viewed as being used for agriculture purposes. In that case, they would deem that as commercial. But again, if you are planning on doing any sort of building a specific building for food processing or on-farm store, reach out to your municipality, reach out to MPAC, and determine how that's going to affect your property taxes, because it will. And you don't want that startle of, oh my goodness, why did my property taxes increase so much? So just keep that in mind when it comes to property taxes. So switching gears to we'll start talking more about public health now. So because you are processing food on your property, if that's the plan of attack you're going for, you are required by public health to register that location with them. So, so I will say, and again, depending on where everybody's from, will determine the different rules. So please reach out to your local public health authority or agency and find out what the process is to register. It can be pretty simple, where you just go onto their website, fill in the information, and then submit it. And if they come back and say yes, go ahead, then that's it. You may see search and inspections happen. We'll get into that a little bit later on. But again, the idea of registering your food processing location is you're letting public health know what type of foods are being processed, what foods are being handled, how the building or area is going to be what's the layout of that area. And again, this does not necessarily have to happen. Like, you have to register your location, whether or not it's a standalone structure, or if it's something where you're doing in your own kitchen or in the basement, or an offshoot of another building. You still have to register it, even though there might be multiple uses to that building. So just keep that in mind. That's not necessarily meant like, if you're a smaller operation who is just doing this part-time, you may think, oh well, I don't have to register your location. That's not necessarily true. You will have to reach out and tell public health what you're doing, because again, they take health and safety very seriously, especially when it comes to food contamination and whatnot. Public health agency, when you start registering your location, they'll also go through the different rules that you will have to follow. That might include, what their inspection regiment is, how often they inspect the facility or area. And as I mentioned, that public health will do inspections. So just be prepared for that. And ultimately, they're going to determine, are you meeting the standards of their needs or their requirements, so that you are producing that safe food product that's not going to get anybody sick. So when you're dealing with public health, they do view food processing in two different lights. So there's low risk foods and then there's high risk foods. So the low risk foods are the foods that are considered to be non-hazardous and would not spoil because of time or temperature. What I mean by will not spoil because of time, I ultimately do realize that all foods will spoil after a while. But again, it's time or temperature may not be as crucial compared to other foods, and we'll get into some examples about it. But where with high risk foods, you're looking at foods that will spoil very quickly if they are not handled properly, if they're not in the constant temperature, if they're not if they have sat on the shelves for too long. So again, low risk foods, you'll see some examples would be like your cakes. They are considered to be low risk, especially when you have icing that is, does not require refrigeration. So if you're using icing sugar versus, any sort of dairy products, your icing sugar will be considered to be less risky compared to cakes that have icing that deals with dairy products or requires refrigeration. Whereas like your high risk foods are going to be dealing with like your meat, your dairy, your eggs, especially products that have a significant amount. So like an example that I saw when I was looking at Grey Bruce Health Agency or Health Unit, like as they say, most items require eggs in their baking, but again, they didn't seem to be too concerned about one or two eggs, but they're more concerned of pies that are like with custard in it, right? Because custard is a very significant amount of eggs, and does take a certain finesse to make and make right. So again, so just keep that in mind. And again, I strongly suggest that when you are thinking about this, take the time, and you'll hear this speech a little bit later on too. Take the time, reach out to public health. They're not there to be the boogeyman. They're there to make sure that that the food is being handled properly, being prepared properly, so that people don't get sick. So ask them as many questions as possible, because ultimately they are going to be the ones that will say yay or nay to your food processing options. So just keep that in mind. Again, when it comes to handling food, there is a food handler training course that you must have at least one person in your operation during the operation of your food processing to have. And for devilment's sake, I went on and looked at some violations that certain public health units, they will list out, the restaurants, the commercial kitchens or whatnot, and any certain violations that they have faced. And as you say, there's one that intrigued me is that there was a time at a restaurant where there was no one on staff that had this food handler training course. So keep that in mind, that whenever you are processing any sort of food, you must have somebody there as either a staff member or a manager or yourself as an owner to have this food handler training course or certificate with you. Because ultimately you are supposed to know all the rules and regulations when it comes to handling food properly, right? So again, the course is there to outline the do's and don'ts of handling food and to minimize any risk of food contamination. You have three options to take this course. You can do it in person, virtually, or self-study. So just keep that in mind. Each public health unit will have different rules, so reach out to them. They will have outlined what the different costs are associated with, the different options you're taking the course. And then also too, depending on the course, if you are taking this as a recertification, because certificate does end after 5 years, you might be able to just, skip ahead, jump into the exam at a reduced rate. So just keep that in mind. So, but as I mentioned before, and I'll mention it over and over and over again tonight, reach out to your local public health authority and see what the rules are in your location, and then ultimately go forward from there. So the next on the list of tonight, we're going to look at food incubators. So because you are starting out and you may not have the resources to start your food processing empire, so there are options out there for you to work with, these food incubators. They can help you, walk you through the different processes in terms of developing recipes, doing any sort of food processing within, like doing your own food processing within their facilities, as well as storage and whatnot. So they're a useful tool for you to use. And as I mentioned there, allows you access to a commercial kitchen, possibly offer you food storage, depending on the location, as well as providing advice on how you can make your process efficient, and also, help you through selling your product ultimately, so you can make money. So there will be a cost, like everything else. There's always a cost when you're using a food incubator. But again, if you're trying to figure out what your options are in terms of what products you want to make, this is a good place to start to kind of determine what products you want to create, what type of products you want to process, and as you say, looking at your, at the end of the day, how much money you're going to be able to make. Based on my knowledge, and by no means I'm going to say I'm not necessarily an expert, but I'm only aware of 2 main food incubators in Ontario. And if you're in Grey Bruce, Ontario, they're a fair distance away. So the first one is London Food Processing Incubator Project. So that's down in London. That's at the London Western Fairgrounds. That just came online, I believe, in the last 3 years, if I'm not mistaken. And then there's also the Ontario Agri-Food Venture Center that's out in Colborne. So if you don't know where that is, it's very far away. Think of east of Toronto. I do know there's more food incubators in downtown Toronto that you could use, but again, it is not maybe the most viable option for you. So with that being said, just because of the distance, I realize that you may be able to still use these food incubators to help you get started, determining kind of what your products that you should be producing, refine that recipe, get some advice. But ultimately, I do realize that you may not be able to use them as a full blown commercial kitchen to do your day-to-day cooking or food processing. So with that being said, you can rent out commercial kitchens that would allow you to do your food processing. You ultimately have to provide the labor and tools and equipment and whatnot in terms of pots, pans. There will be some there, but if you have any specialized equipment needed, they would have that. You have to bring that there, but they'll have the basic necessities like a stove, potable water, dishwasher, et cetera, et cetera. So ultimately renting a commercial kitchen might be your best option, especially if you're just starting out, and you don't want to necessarily try and take over your home kitchen to do your food processing and then be subject to all those inspections. With that being said, go to your local public health authority. They will have a list of all the different commercial kitchens that are available to you. Some of the ones that you might be able to rent may include different community centers, arenas, and then other food processing businesses. And ultimately, it's your responsibility if you're planning on using your local arena, because 9 times out of 10 there will be a commercial kitchen connected there. Just double check and make sure that they have been inspected recently and that they've passed their inspection, that there's no violations. because if you're operating in a commercial kitchen that has some violations against them or outstanding violations, you may get yourself into some hot water. So just keep that in mind. But this is maybe a more easier option for you to get started. If, as I mentioned earlier, if you don't want to, renovate your house and develop install a commercial kitchen in your basement or in an outbuilding or whatnot, you might be able to reach out to your local municipality or other food processing businesses and ultimately use theirs when not in use. So keep that in mind when you're going through this process. So that's the more general aspects of starting your direct to consumer farm business. I don't know if there's any questions per se from that. Again, it's a lot of information. We'll get into more specific information shortly, but I just thought I'd ask the question and see if anybody has any questions or thoughts.
There's nothing in the chat, but please, if you do have any questions, just unmute and you can pose them to Eric. Nothing yet. I kind of wonder, Eric, I know, or I think that the Catapult Grey Bruce, the Sydenham campus, they are planning to have a kitchen there. It's not up yet, but I kind of wonder if that will be another opportunity for people to use that kitchen. Have you heard about that?
Go ahead. Sorry, Laurie.
Have you heard about that that kitchen? I know it's not available yet.
Yeah, no, I that did come across my mind when I heard about, like when I thought of it, and then this presentation. I just figured it hasn't been out yet, so I figured I'd better leave it off and not say that.
Yeah, well, I just thought, people can maybe listen. I know they're hoping that they'll have a fully usable kitchen for people, but yeah, as you say, it's not there yet. Yeah. And I don't see any questions in the chat, so.
We'll keep on going.
Cool.
We'll take a break in about a half an hour or so to give people some time to stretch their legs and whatnot. But we'll keep on going if that's okay with you, Laurie. So
sounds great.
I took a second to take a drink so I can catch my breath, because again, I realize that I do apologize. There's a lot of information I'm throwing at you, but again, take the time. Try and jot down as much notes, and if you really want to, you can re-listen to the presentation again, and you can hear this all over again and listen to my voice if that so works. So we'll now move into more in-depth conversations about getting your direct to consumer, your direct farm marketing business going now. First off, we're going to start focusing on financing. If you have taken my previous or our previous sessions on crops and livestock, this is going to be pretty much the same thing. I'll be first to mention that there's not as many, well, to my knowledge, there's no specific financing options for your direct to consumer or direct farm marketing businesses. So with that being said, I would strongly suggest depending on what crops you're growing or livestock you're raising, if you're looking at ways to finance your operation, you might want to be financing the more primary side of your business, so your crops and your livestock, rather than your leaving the more general financing options for your direct to consumer or direct farm marketing portion of your business. So, so with that being said, the three things that we're going to talk about tonight are your lines of credit, your term loans, and your leases. We'll just get started. Again, if you've heard this presentation before, I apologize. You're going to hear it again. But ultimately, these are valuable information for you to understand your different options. So first off, we're going to look at lines of credit. Again, lines of credit are going to be focusing more on your short-term cash flow situation, your shortages. So like if you're paying any sort of inputs. So again, looking at a direct farm marketing option, especially in terms of food processing, you ultimately have to pay for, your packaging. So if it's jars or cellophane or whatnot, so you would use your line of credit. If you don't have the money available, use your line of credit to finance those types of purchases. So stuff that you ultimately will be paid within a year. And as well as the line of credit's a revolving credit, so you can pay it down as quickly as possible. You can run it up as quickly as possible. Ultimately, you will be given a maximum credit limit. So as long as you stay within that or below that limit, you're fine to do whatever it takes. So so that's the nice thing about it. It has that flexibility. There's no penalties for you to pay off your line of credit earlier. But ultimately, interest is also charged on a daily basis at a reduced rate compared to other options. But as you say, the moment that you withdraw that money and you dip into your line of credit, interest will start. So just keep that in mind. Also, too, when it comes to lines of credit, there are monthly fees, whether or not you are using your line of credit or not. So just keep that in mind. And again, the whole idea of a line of credit is to deal with short-term cash flow issues or shortfalls, dealing with any sort of your expenses that you will know that you'll get that money back within a year and whatnot. So just keep that in mind. Term loans, on the other hand, they're meant to be purchasing assets. So again, in a direct farm marketing option, again, a kitchen, for instance, the equipment that you need within a commercial kitchen or your own kitchen, you will more likely look at term loans just because of the fact that the life of that kitchen or life of those types of assets are in that 5 to 10 year span. And ultimately, you can get that financed and spread out for 5 or 10 years. Term loans have it can be variable interest rates, or it can be fixed rates depending on your needs. So just keep that in mind. You have some flexibility there. And then also too, payments are made on a regular basis. So it could be on a monthly, quarterly, semi-annually, annually, depending on how you structure your term loans. So whereas, as I mentioned, lines of credit, you have the flexibility to pay down or withdraw money at any time. Here, once you've done it, once you sign the paperwork, that's it. You have a specific schedule that you must follow, especially when it comes to payments. One thing about term loans, again, you're dealing with, there will be a fee associated, but it's usually a one-time fee, and that's charged at the beginning of the contract. There's no fees usually charged throughout the life of the loan. As I mentioned, where with a line of credit, that's happening on on a monthly basis. And again, idea of it is to be purchasing any sort of equipment. Again, purchasing any sort of, like I have here, like vines, but it can also be trees. So if you're planning on having an apple orchard or dealing with pear trees or whatever, any sort of living items that require more than a year. Also cattle, for instance, especially cows, not necessarily feeder cattle, but any sort of breeding stock would fit well into a term loan to help finance and smooth out your cash flow situation. Then we're going to talk about leases very briefly. So again, very similar to term loans, but again, you're making, again, monthly, semi-annually, quarterly, annual payments. Again, the normal lifespan of a lease is, again, between 3 and 7 years based on the equipment that you're purchasing. And then also too, if your equipment is more than 20 years of age, you may not be able to get a lease for that. So, but again, that depends on the situation. So if you have a question about that, please reach out to the leasing company that you're working with, and they'll be able to tell you whether or not it's eligible to be leased or not. Interest is fixed compared to term loans. There's no variable option for a lease. But with that being said, interest is usually more expensive on a lease compared to a term loan. So just the life cycle or lifespan of a lease. So at the start of the lease, you're looking at providing a down payment as well as a security deposit for that lease, as well as ultimately you have to sign on the dotted line like everything else. Throughout the life of the lease, you're looking at biweekly to semi-annual payments depending on the situation. One thing that people do like about a lease is that payments are tax deductible. So you can deduct that on your interest on your income tax return every year until the lease is paid out. With that being said, leases are also subject to HST, so that's another cost that you have to absorb, and then ultimately, if you're registered for HST, you can get that back. But again, you have to pay that money up front and then wait for a check to come back to you. So, and again, go through the earlier presentation on HST. And then finally, at the end of the lease, again, you have, I have two options down here, but really you do have three options. So the first option that we'll talk about is asset return. So that is a situation where at the end of the lease, you say, you know what, I don't need this piece of equipment anymore. I'm retiring, or I'm going to switch gears and move into a different direction. You can tell the leasing company, assuming it's in good repair, to pick up their piece of equipment and take it away, and then the payments would stop. Simple as that. Another option is that you can do a buyout option. So that can be a situation where as low as $1 at the end of the lease, you can pay for that piece of equipment, and then you own it, I should say. You don't necessarily see $1 buyout options as much anymore. Usually it's about 10% that they kind of go for, but again, each option's different, and depending on your buyout option will also affect how much your monthly or your payments throughout the life of the lease will be. Your third and final option, the option I did not put in here, is ultimately you could still keep paying against the lease and treat it as a rental expense. That is another option. Ideally, people probably won't do that per se, just because of the fact that you're still paying that same annual payments without actually bringing down the debt. But at the same time, though, it is another option that you can use for when you're looking at your cash flow situation. So that's the three main financing strategies or options available to you. With that being said, as I mentioned at the beginning, there aren't really any specific direct-to-consumer or direct farm marketing financing options available. So you're kind of having to use your more general options like your lines of credit, term loans, and leases. With that being said, think back to your operation. It might make more sense to use commodity specific options, so like your advanced payments program or your beef breeder or feeder co-ops to finance the actual commodity itself, and then use your lines of credit, your term loans, and your leases for your direct-to-consumer side of the business. So keep that in mind. So our next thing that we're going to talk about is record keeping. So there's lots when it comes to record keeping, and by no means the different options that I'm going to go over, or the different examples I'm going to go over tonight, is definitely not the all of the record keeping you have to keep, especially if you're looking at food processing. It's going to be there's going to be a significant amount of record keeping you'll have to keep. But I just want to give you a few different options for you to think about, and then ultimately, as you say, when you get into doing your planning of your business, then you can go into the more the nitty gritty and find out what the different records you have to keep. So keep that in mind. So the first one we'll talk about is your harvest records. So again, depending on how you are planning on selling your goods, your produce, that your consumers may want to see when your crops were harvested, how they were stored, kind of what's your variety, any sort of work that's been done to it. But we're going to talk about harvesting it more so than anything. So again, this can be as complicated or as simple as you want. So just right here, when it comes to harvesting harvest records, some options for you to be recording when you are doing that harvesting is what type of crop, as you say, lettuce, get into your different varieties, because there's multiple different varieties when it comes to your different crops. When you harvest it, that said crop, and then date or how it was stored. So as you say, date that went to the fridge or cooler. What is the temperature of the cooler? You can have that included as well. And then if you, depending on your operation, you may have a lot number. But again, for a small farm business, you may not need it. So that's why I said if applicable. But again, the whole idea of having the harvest record is just to make sure that you know where your produce is being when it's been harvested, and then ultimately when it gets sold, right? Because you don't want a situation where you've harvested a certain produce or crop, and then it gets shoved to the back, and then 2, 3, 4, 5 weeks later or months later, you wonder why you're short of lettuce, and you realize, oh wait, there's this one harvest that we did not pick up on, and it got shoved to the back and did not get sold. So by having these records and knowing when it's been harvested, that you can kind of keep more track on your inventory and ultimately how you are turning your inventory over, right? How you're harvesting it and then ultimately selling it. Second option or second record keeping example that you're going to be looking at, depending on your situation, is labeling of products. So again, if you are doing any sort of processing of food on your farm, again, I must have been thinking about strawberries when I was writing this presentation, because I keep talking about strawberries and strawberry jam, ultimately you have to have some form of a label on that product. Even if you're not necessarily doing any food processing on your farm. So like if you're getting to beef, for instance, or meat of any kind, you'll still have to provide some form of a label on that product. So some examples for bare minimum for your labels require listing off all your ingredients. So if it's beef or if it's your lettuce or whatnot, maybe not as critical to list that. Well, you'll have to just list the lettuce or just the one item. But if there's a product name, so if it's, again, in terms of food processing, if it's jam or preserve or some kind, you have to list the product name, your name, so who's selling this product, as well as the address of the said product. With that being said, depending on how much food processing you're doing, will require how much of a label you need. So the Canadian Food Inspection Agency, that is the federal government agency that focuses on labeling of products. They do have a little toolkit on their website, or kind of assessment where you can, enter in what you are trying to process or produce, and they will tell you what type of labeling requirements you require. So there's the website at the bottom of your screen or on your page there that you can go to, and they'll walk you through the different rules and regulations of having a label. Again, here we're just talking more of, the basic necessities. Depending on your situation, you may have to get into nutritional labeling. That's a whole different kettle of fish there, I can tell you that. So just keep that in mind. So when you are trying to assess what options you're going for, think about labeling, because that can be a significant aspect of your business that you may not be prepared for, depending on if you haven't thought about it, right? So just keep that in mind. And finally, before we take a break, again, we're looking at more of the food processing side of the world again. So cold holding temperature logs, So again, if you're into any sort of food processing, and especially your products require any sort of refrigeration, you are supposed to have a log posted where you track that you have actually checked the temperature of your cooling area, so a fridge or a cooler. And so quite literally, your log should have what month it is, what the date is, the day, so May 1st, March 1st, March 30th, whatever the temperature reading is of that area. So again, you write down if it was 3.5 degrees Celsius, or if you decide to go into Fahrenheit, make sure you identify that's Fahrenheit. um, Provide initials, or the person who actually checks it should initial saying that they have checked it. And if there was a situation where your cooling area, your fridge or cooler, were not at the right temperature. So most cases, when it comes to public health and having the right temperature, they're looking at 4 degrees and below. So if you have a situation where your fridge or cooler is above 4 degrees, you're supposed to be writing down what you have done. So either turn the dial down so that it actually cools, or making any sort of replacements, or had to purchase a new piece of equipment because of burned up compressor or motor or whatnot. So just keep that in mind. Again, when it comes to these things, when you work with your public health agency, they'll walk through the different logs that you have to follow. So with that being said, I believe we're getting darn close to 8 o'clock if we haven't. I think it might be a good time for us to just take a little bit of a break, stretch our legs. You probably heard enough of me rambling on so far. So Lori, if you're okay, maybe 5 minutes for people to stretch their legs, grab a drink, use the washroom, and then we'll get back going, and we'll finish this session off tonight, okay?
Sounds great, Eric. So about 8:03, 8:04 or so.
Sounds good.
Take care. Eric, there's a question in the chat. Quick question regarding regulations around storing meats that have been processed elsewhere but are being sold on site. Do you need to take the food handling course, and are the food processing items you've covered required?
That's a good question. I'm not 100% sure on that. Because as you say, my understanding is that if you are handling any sort of food, whether or not it's you processed it or not, you should have that food handler's safety course or certificate. With that being said, what I would strongly suggest is talk to your local public health authority, because they may have certain rules associated with it. Another option too, and again, depending on where you're selling, we're going to get talking about that in a few minutes, is like farmers market, for instance. They do have specific rules for selling produce and products at your booth or at your space. So it can depend on how you are selling and where you're selling it to, right? So, but if you are concerned, I would strongly take the time and just reach out to your public health authority and get an official ruling or official statement, so that ultimately you are safe on both ends, right?
Like, I know some places they will get all the packages home from the abattoir. If the meat's all wrapped up, they are
Yeah.
simply adding labels or whatever before they
Mhm.
head to the market in Toronto. So you're really not handling the meat. So yeah, I have no idea.
Yeah, that's, and as you say, and I think that's the other issue too, is that those types of situations can be very subjective, right? And what you and I might think as common sense, somebody else might think as not common sense, and they may have a more upsetting view. So as I say, if you have any of those types of concerns, number one thing in my eyes would be is go reach out directly with the authority, because they're going to be the ones that ultimately say, yes, you're okay in doing this, or no, you have to do it our way, or else you get slapped with fines and fees and whatnot, and nobody wants to pay that. Let's be
So
honest,
better
right?
to know
Yes.
than not ask.
The ignorance is not always bliss.
Right.
So, the reality is that you may not like the answer, and I wish I could give you other options, but ultimately, it is the public health authority or the farmers market or whatnot that call the shots, right? So ultimate, and I understand from their perspective, they don't want anybody to get injured or killed because of mishandled food, right? And I think everybody's in that same boat. It's just whether or not the rules and regulations, whether or not you agree with them or not, those are the rules and regulations, and each public health authority have different uh, aspects or different views on it, right? So just keep that in mind. The other thing too, especially when you're talking about beef or meat of some kind coming from the abattoir, would be, again, temperature control. Because when you're pulling it from the abattoir, it's coming, depending on what type of meat it is, if it's beef or pork or lamb or goat, most likely it's going to be frozen. Chicken is usually chilled, unless you pay extra for it to be frozen, which I think most people just get it chilled. But ultimately, unless you are living right at the abattoir, which I don't think anybody would want to, you ultimately have to take meat products from a controlled environment to your home or to your farm store. And how are you going to control or make sure that that temperature is going to stay at that 4 degrees or below? And ultimately, it has to be in that below 4 degrees, or else bacteria grow and then bad things happen, right? So it's just one of those things where, however, the public health authority is, will dictate kind of what your different options or solutions are to ultimately, you don't want to have to. you want to be as cost effective as possible, but again, you have to think about public health safety. And ultimately, one thing I will say is that if you're using it for your own like your own consumption, your own family consumption, again, the rules are a lot different. Practically, it's fair game for whatever compared to if you're selling it. And that's the kicker is that once you're planning on selling that product or that produce, you have to abide by public health.
Perfect. Thank you.
So with that being said, Lori, I don't know if there might be another question just popped up here.
No, it's just a thank you.
Oh, okay. I haven't opened up the chat yet, so thank you. I guess we'll get started, Lori, if that's okay with you.
Sounds great.
We might be done. We'll should have some time at the end of the presentation for questions as well. And I know we're going to get into more of your different options for selling into the second half of tonight's presentation. But first off, before we get started into your different ways to market, we're going to look at your cost of production. So if you've heard my previous our previous sessions in the past, cost of production is very key. But again, when you're getting into food processing, so again, if you're selling beef or meat, or if you're selling produce, or you're selling any sort of food products that you have processed on your farm or in a commercial kitchen, ultimately you need to know how to price your products. Okay. There we go. So when it comes to calculating, there's the 3 C's of pricing. So you'll see on your screen there. So you have 3 options. So you can price based on your competitors. So what are your competitors charging? So if you are in a situation where you have multiple farmers that are doing a similar thing compared to you down your road or in your neighborhood, how are they pricing out their produce or their products? So that's one way of pricing. Another option is to look at your actual cost. So, what's your time, your labor, what's your inputs, if it's, seeds and tillage or weeding or, harvesting, or as you say, if you get into the food processing world of, jars, packaging, any sort of additional ingredients, sugar, flour, etc. Figure out what your different costs are, and then do your selling price based on that. Or ultimately, what is the customer going to pay, or what are they willing to pay, right? When it comes to why people decide to do direct farm marketing or selling directly to the consumer, I think that at least 75 to 80% of the people will say that they want to be able to, dictate the price, because most farmers ultimately are price takers. So if you're into the cash crop world or into the livestock world, ultimately you are getting the price of your livestock or price of your commodities is what you've been told that's what you're going to get. Whereas with direct farm marketing or direct to consumer, you call the shots. So you can charge whatever price in theory you want, but ultimately the consumer is going to be the final has the final say. If they feel that your product is overpriced, they won't buy. So you have to keep that in mind, that you want to be able to have a price set that your consumers are willing to pay, but covers your costs, but is competitive with your don't want to say competitive farmers, but ultimately everybody's trying to sell their produce, sell their products, right? So keep that in mind, that ultimately when you're factoring in your cost of production or your price of selling, you're factoring in all 3 situations. And as I mentioned, that when it comes to it, consumers will have the final say. And also too, keep in mind that when you are determining how what types of products you are producing, you should also be looking at, who are you selling these products to? And so one aspect of it is location. So if you are on a back road somewhere where there's very little traffic, having an on-farm store may not be your best option, just because of the fact that you don't have very much traffic, or as you say, if you're on a major highway, so up in this neck of the woods, you're looking at Highway 6, where, especially during the summertime, there's a lot of cottage traffic on it. There's a lot of traffic just in general. An on-farm store might be a more viable option. Also, too, when you're stopping, you think of it, are you planning on selling your produce based on, the influx of, visitors to the area, or are you planning on selling your produce to kind of your tried and true, other farmers or people that are making maybe minimum wage? You have to be able to determine what your niche market is, or what your market is, so that ultimately you can be profitable and be able to sell your product, your produce, and be profitable, because that's ultimately your issue, or your situation is that you need to make money one way or another, right? So with that being said, we're going to talk more about calculating your cost. So again, some of the options when you're looking at your cost production, you should be looking at kind of your profit margin. So the profit margin, as a quick aside, is your revenue from your product minus all your costs. That's your profit margin. That's a pretty simplistic calculation. There's a little bit more to it, but that's ultimately the simple way of calculating your profit margin. So in some cases, people might want to see a profit margin of 50% or 60%, depending on the situation. So then they factor in that when they're setting the price, as well as, but you ultimately do need to know what your costs are that are associated with growing or raising or producing that product. So at the bottom of your screen there, or in your slides there, you'll see a quick little table of just some examples of how the different costs associated to your cost production is broken down to. So you have more of your variable costs, and then your fixed costs. So your variable costs, labor, packaging, sugar. So those are your costs that change depending on how much you produce. Whereas your fixed costs they stay the same, or relatively the same, no matter how much you're producing. So again, like your property taxes, your telephone, your interest. Again, this is just a quick subset of a quick example. As I say, but take the time when you are at the stage where you figured out, what product or produce you're selling. Then you have to figure out, how to price that product, right? And that's where, if you had an access to a food incubator, they can walk you through that process. But if you don't, talk to your accountant or a farm business advisor or a mentor. They will be able to walk you through that a little bit more hand in hand, and help you in determining that price. So, as I mentioned, when it comes to cost producing, you should be doing this on a regular basis. So that's going to change depending on what type of operation you have. So if you are a small operation, cost of production may only happen, once every couple of months, depending on, how often you harvest. But if you're a larger operation, you might be calculating your cost of production on a more regular basis, maybe once a week, once a day, depending on your situation, right? So you can see there, what I just mentioned. With that being said, there are a couple of resources within Ontario, or the OMAFRA website, for you. Again, this is more focusing on food processing. So there is a cost of meat processing tool there on your screen, that link there. And then also too, that if you're planning on doing any sort of farm processing, so like turning strawberries into strawberry jam or strawberry juice, You can, when you have more complicated recipes, there's a tool here where you can enter in all your information, and then it'll help you determine what that cost is, so that you at least know what's your bare minimum that you have to set your price to sell, to at least recoup those costs and hopefully make some extra money. One quick comment I will make, that both of these tools are both Excel spreadsheets, so you can enter your information in, and it will ultimately kick out a number for you, so you can at least do some analysis and see if that's makes sense or is reasonable to your operation. So I know that's a quick and fast conversation about cost production. I know there's lots of things to it. So as I said, if you do have any questions, you're more than welcome to reach out to myself, or as you say, reach out to any sort of an advisor, an accountant. They'll be able to help you with the different calculations that you'll have to look at. So next on the list is options to sell your produce or your products. So this is, now we're getting into more of the marketing side of things. So ultimately, this is going to be a big part of a direct farm marketing or direct to consumer farm operation. So again, more of a traditional farm would not necessarily need to worry about, your options, or because ultimately that's being taken care of by an elevator, auction market, or a food processor, where here everything's being done by you, or you ultimately have the decision of how you're going to market, how you're going to sell your products. So the questions that you need to be thinking about is, what is the story that you're going to tell your customer base? So what makes you different compared to the next door neighbor who's also has who's also doing direct to consumer or direct farm marketing operation, right? Are you just focusing on your livestock based products, so your meats, your cheeses, your eggs, sausages, etc., and they're focusing on the produce, so your lettuce, tomatoes. I almost got talking a little country slang there. Your tomatoes, your potatoes, etc. Or are you looking at being maybe organic, or looking at more of more niche markets? So you need to be able to determine what makes you unique, and what makes you the first choice for your customer base to go to you every week or every month or every year to go and buy their product, buy your product from you, right? So make sure you understand that. Again, you need to know what the needs, the wants, the desires of your customer base is, because ultimately that's what you're trying to meet. And then also too, as I mentioned a little bit a few minutes ago, does it make sense to be selling a high value good to someone who's maybe making minimum wage, or someone who is not able to afford that additional cost? So I'll be honest, I was at Grey Bruce Farmers Week this year. I believe it was Dairy Day, if I'm not mistaken. And there was a University of Guelph professor who talked about his phone was ringing off the hook. And it's all because of a news article by CTV Toronto. So if you ever want to read it, it's the first link there. And the Toronto reporter was in a grocery store looking at chicken, and I believe it was chicken breast for both $35, $36 for maybe a pound and a half. And there's quite a bit of outrage about that. Why is chicken so darn expensive? And ultimately here, what it was, the Coles Notes version is that it was a higher valued product. It was free from products, so free from antibiotics, free from growth hormones or whatnot. And so as you say, if it was regular chicken, it was an outrageous price, but because it was there was more value add to it. There was a reason for the increased price, but it wasn't displayed quite just 100%. It wasn't labeled properly, or it wasn't labeled significantly so that people noticed what the difference was. And there was quite a bit of upset and hoopla about it. And so the professor who from the University of Guelph, he actually wrote a blog, and that's the link at the bottom there, the Food Focus Guelph, and it quite literally talks about how this conversation happened, and the reasons the reason for the outrage, and ultimately how the grocery store had to explain that this was a value added product, and it wasn't the more cost efficient product. So that's why I want to make sure that I get explained clear enough, is that you need to know what your customer base is and price accordingly, right? So that ultimately you don't want to be selling a high value product to a group of people that may not be able to afford, or do not necessarily have the same value that they're willing to place on that type of product. So just keep that in mind. So again, as I mentioned, I believe a few times, marketing, this is very important, because ultimately this is your job now. In addition to growing the produce or growing the livestock, and then arranging processing or processing yourself, you now have to market and sell it. So we'll get at some different options that are available to you. Is it an exhaustive list? No. Is it a list that might be available, or all the options available to you specifically? Possibly not, depending on where you're from, what your situation is, and what is the greater community's ability. So just keep that in mind, that I'll talk about 4 different options that are available, but just keep in mind not all 4 operations or situations may be best suited for your situation. So the first one is farmers markets. So that's pretty self-explanatory, where, as you say, most of the province has a farmers market within a half an hour, 45-minute drive around. I looked at Grey Bruce, Ontario. We have 6 up here. And the ironic thing is that based on Farm Markets Ontario, there's actually none going along 21 until you hit Goderich. So there's a part of Bruce County that has to actually drive inland to go to a farmer's market. So something of interest there. But ultimately, the idea of having a farmer's market is that you rent a space or a booth, you set up your product, and then people come in, and then the buying and selling happens, right? So there's no guarantee that you're going to ultimately sell your produce or your goods. You do mention, as I mentioned earlier, there are food safety and other rules that you must follow when you're dealing with farmers markets. So just keep that in mind, that you fully understand what the rules are, so that you're not in contravention. Some of the rules might be that in addition to like food safety or food health, hygiene is, where are your products coming from? As you say, are they from your farm? Or I know there's an issue a few years back about farmers or resellers going to the food terminal and then selling the food at a farmer's market, or produce at a farmer's market. So just keep that in mind, that when you purchase that spot, that you understand the rules and how to abide by them. And then also too, you can see there that the rules might change depending on what type of product. So if you're dealing with any sort of dairy, or again, your high risk foods, as I mentioned before, versus your low risk foods, might also determine what specific rules or requirements you must follow in terms of having a cooler, or making sure that produce is off the ground or away from animals, like dogs or whatnot, pets, when people are walking up and down the different farmers markets. So there is a link to Farm Markets Ontario. So they list out the different farmers markets that are around, and then also to kind of go through the different rules associated that you will have to follow, and then ultimately who you contact to buy a space or rent a space. So another option that's available to you when it comes to selling your produce or goods is independent local or grocery store cooperatives. So this is a situation where this really depends on what part of the world you're from. If you're in Southern Grey County or Northern Grey County, or if you're from other parts of the province, there might be different options available to you. So when you're looking at Grey County, Grey and Bruce County, I believe, if I'm not mistaken, the food marketing Chesley is a food cooperative, or it's an independent local grocery store. So you have maybe a better option to go and meet with an independent grocery store on how you can sell your produce or your products within their store compared to a large chain store. They have specific rules and regulations because of the quantities of produce and products that they go through. So it is another option available to you. So you'll have to do some research on your own to determine what local grocery stores might be more receptive to receiving local produce or local products, made on farm. They also might have specific requirements for you in terms of, how much quantity that you have to provide, or, how often you have to provide it, depending on the situation. The one plus about a local grocery store or cooperative is that they ultimately do the marketing for you, as well as they deal with the selling aspects of your products. So you don't necessarily have to worry about that. But on the flip side of it, you will not necessarily get the same price as if you sold directly to the consumer or doing it through an on-farm store or whatnot. So you just have to keep that in mind, that there are trade-offs. And I will mention that when we're going through these slides here about the different options, you might look at these and think, oh my goodness, there's a lot of negative aspects to each option. And there are, but I would also look at that you have to determine, or you have to look at each situation to your operation and see that, is this something that I'm willing to do? And do these, things, negative aspects, or just, the fact of how to sell, are you okay with how it works within your operation, right? So just keep that in mind. There's a lot of pluses to it, but at the same time, though, I want to make sure that everybody's aware that there are certain aspects that you need to be mindful of when you decide which option you're going to sell your produce or your goods. Another option that you can look at is the community supported agriculture, or CSAs. And again, this is a situation where you can sell your produce or your products through bundles or boxes or shares. So in most cases, most farmers from January to March, they will offer, people, or invite people to start purchasing their bundles for the year, and or the boxes or their shares. And then ultimately then, is it every week or every month? You have the option as a member, when you're buying a CSA share, to go, you can pick up certain items depending on what option you chose, and then you go home and use whatever aspect. So the one thing about CSAs is that it can be quite flexible in terms of how you run these programs. You can have it so that specifically, if you choose option A, that you get so many pounds of lettuce or so many pounds of potatoes and so many pounds of this. Or, another option is that you can choose up to 35 pounds or $35 worth of produce, and whatever produce that you want. Here's the list of the different produce that's available, and the price per unit. Choose what you want, and then if you hit $35, that's it. That's all you can. Or if you've gone over, you can pay for the extra. Or you have some unique options on how you can custom your operation to meet the needs of your customers. So that's one great thing about a CSA. Most CSAs do happen throughout the growing season, so spring, summer, fall. But there are some CSAs out there that do have a winter option. But again, you're looking at farmers that have a greenhouse, and a greenhouse that can be winterized or can be heated throughout the winter, which does mean additional costs. But ultimately, that is another option depending on your situation. Also, too, when it comes to CSAs, most cases the consumer is paying upfront, so that gives you some extra financing or extra cash flow so that you can purchase, the seed, the fertilizer. If you're looking at any sort of chemicals, or if you're looking at labor, having a CSA, you have that money up front that you can ultimately, get that seed in the ground growing and ultimately harvested, right? But ultimately, though, with all the money up front, you have to be able to be good financial people to spread that money throughout the whole year, so that ultimately you can pay off all the bills because all the money is coming up front. The one downside when it comes to CSAs is that because the consumer is paying upfront at the beginning of the year, and it might be very difficult to plan out your situation when if you find any sort of drought issues or weather issues or disease or pests that might affect your production. So you'll have to work with your consumers, your CSA members, if you're in a situation where your produce, you're not able to produce as much because of external factors, and if it means giving them different options of produce or products that they can buy in substitution of, or whatnot. It's ultimately up to you as a CSA farmer, and then to the consumer to work out how to smooth out those types of issues. Finally, the final option we're going to talk about too, well, actually, it's not finally, there's another option after this. But an on-farm store is another option for you to sell your goods. Again, this is a situation where you have a separate building on your farm where you can have consumers come in at any time, whenever it's open, depending on your situation. And it allows you to practically be a grocery store, depending on how much produce and products you're going to have. An on-farm store is more of a situation where you are large enough where you're not just growing one or two items, that you might be growing multiple items, and you're kind of be a one-stop shop for your consumer. But ultimately, by having an on-farm store, that will require you to have some form of labor. So if it's store employees to run the till, to keep store shelves stocked, or yourself, depending on how big of an operation it is. But ultimately, you are then responsible for the marketing and dealing with the selling and all that. So it can be a daunting task for a small farmer to have an on-farm store, but for maybe a larger direct to consumer farm, an on-farm store might make sense. As mentioned earlier, back at the beginning of the presentation, having a specific on-farm store might affect your property taxes in terms of switching it over into to being commercial for the land associated in the building associated with your on-farm store. So just keep that in mind. Finally, I don't think I'm going to get ahead of myself this time. Finally, the last option we're going to look at is online stores. So that's the joys of living in the 21st century. As I said, now things can be done online. So it gives smaller farmers an option to sell their products and produce directly to the consumer without necessarily having an on-farm store. So there are costs associated with having a website and having the infrastructure online to facilitate transactions. You might, in some cases, you might decide to have your online store more so as a order placement situation. So, consumer or customer can go online, say that they want X, Y, Z, and then that gets sent to you. And then when you go to drop off the produce, then they will pay you in cash or credit or debit, whatever your options are. Or you could have an online store where they choose X, Y, Z, they pay for it all in one fell swoop, and money gets deposited into your account, and it's your responsibility to get the produce to them. So there are multiple ways of doing an online store. So just keep that in mind, that if you do choose this option, make sure that you are comfortable with using technology, because ultimately you are dealing with technology. You're dealing with online internet. So if you don't have reliable internet, that might be something to keep in mind when you're considering this option, is what happens if the internet goes away or is not as strong or as reliable. So keep that in mind. And then also too, when you're dealing with online farm stores, social media. Social media is a big aspect. And so if you're not comfortable with social media, then maybe having an online store may not be the best suited option for you. So just keep that in mind. Also too, as I mentioned, there are multiple ways of setting up an online store. We just talked about payment options. There's also, how does the produce or the products get delivered? Are you planning on driving out to the customer's residence and dropping off the produce, or are you going to meet in a centralized area, so in a parking lot, or are they going to come to you and your farm and then pick up the produce there? These are just questions for you to think about, and to ultimately you have to answer. You don't have to answer it right now, but ultimately you are responsible, or when you're dealing with an online store, you ultimately have to think about those key aspects. As you say, first thing is, how do you get the money? And then secondly, how do they get the produce, or how do they get the product, right? So as mentioned, there are programs and services available for farmers to start an online store. As I said, there's multiple programs out there, too many to list. So just keep that in mind, that you don't necessarily have to start from scratch, and you don't have to be a IT specialist or IT developer to create a website. There are definitely programs out there. This would be a good option to reach out to if you have a mentor or an advisor. They can steer you in the right direction, point you in the right direction as to what options are available. With that being said, for a cost share program, there is the Canada Digital Adoption Program, or CDAP. You can see the link on your screen there. So that gives you $2,400 if you are looking at expanding your online presence. There are rules associated with CDAP. First off, you have to have an employee that's not an owner. And then also too, you should have an in-person experience. So if that means people coming to your farm to purchase, I think that would count. But with that being said, go through that website, go through the different rules and regulations associated with it. It is $2,400, so it's not it's not a big amount of money, but at the same time, though, it is can be quite significant if you're just trying to figure out how do you make that final step or take that final plunge into the online market, right? So just keep that in mind.
I was going to mention, Eric, that our neighbors use a commerce site called Local Line, and they've used it since the pandemic. And it seems to be a fairly easy system for them to work, and it's very easy as a consumer as well. So as you said, there's tons of them, but that's the one I'm familiar with, and it seems pretty easy. And you can find it at localline.ca.
Thanks. That's the thing. And as I mentioned earlier, these are the conversations that will help you starting a farm business, is by talking to other people and figuring out what are they doing, and ultimately how they what issues they faced, what programs or what services they used, and ultimately how to help their business. There's stuff that may help. There's stuff that might be a royal pain in the tuchus that you don't want to, you want to stay away from. But how do you know that without experience? So that's where why we're doing these types of presentations. So thanks, Laurie. That's a very good comment. So cognizant of time, I'm going to speed through the rest of the presentation. So we have hopefully about 10 minutes for people to ask questions if need be. Some of the things that I'll talk about, if you've been to the other presentations, have been discussed. But I'm just going to focus more on the specific direct-to-consumer, direct farm marketing aspects of the following conversation. So commodity organizations. So just very briefly, there are commodity organizations available for producers, and they're specifically tied to a commodity. So like Beef Farmers of Ontario, Grain Farmers of Ontario, Grape Growers of Ontario, etc. When it comes to their purposes, they're there to support you in terms of completing research, marketing, or consumer advocacy, checkoff fees, and government advocacy. When it comes to direct to consumer or direct farm marketing aspects, the commodity organizations don't really exist per se. They fall into the following three. Farmers Markets of Ontario, Ontario Farm Fresh Marketing Association, and CSAfarms.ca. So there's no checkoff fees for them. There might be some membership fees that you may have to pay into. That's going to determine based on which option you choose. You can sign up for all three if you really want to, depending on your situation. These commodity or these organizations, they're not overseen by the Ontario Farm Products Marketing Commission. So they're their own standalone. There's no legislation associated with them. Where with commodity organizations like Grain Farmers of Ontario, there is legislation that's associated with it. So, but again, I strongly advise you to take a look at these different organizations. They're the ones that are more tied to that direct to consumer, direct farm marketing aspects. And again, all three of them have very useful information for you as a starting farmer, especially a starting farmer who's looking at that direct to consumer contact. So please take a look. And by no means is this is not an exhaustive list, but at the same time, though, it's a good starting point. Here we're going to just breeze through this when it comes to business risk management programs. Again, these are more focused on the production side of your business. They won't necessarily provide you any sort of specific help for the selling aspect of things. But as you say, if you have any sort of issues with weather or external factors to your crops, production insurance is a good useful tool for that. So you can look at that at your own time, just because I realize it's not maybe as useful tool for a farmer who's looking at a direct-to-consumer or direct farm marketing. Risk management programs, so there's a couple of different options. So this is for livestock. So this is for dealing with any sort of market issues. or cost production issues. Again, that's all through AgriCorps. If you want more information and see if it's a program for you, click on those links there. They go through depending on which options there are. So cattle, hogs, sheep, and veal. I believe somebody mentioned that there's somebody that's looking at goats for their operation. Goat is not part of the risk management program. So just keep that in mind that there's really just 4 livestock components to this program. So just keep that in mind. There's also a risk management program for edible horticulture through a program called self-directed risk management. So that's, again, your fruits, your vegetables, aspect of your produce. So that might be another option for you to participate in. And again, the link's on your screen and in your handouts if you'd like more information. Agri-stability, again, that is another option. Depending on the size of your farm, it might be the best, might be a good solution. It may not be. Please take a look at your own time and see if agri-stability is something useful for you. This is where you probably should be talking to your accountant or your income tax preparer and see if that is something that is worth completing. And Agri-Invest, again, it's a similar idea to the risk management program for edible horticulture. Again, the details are on your screen there. Again, more so focusing for the production side of your operation and less about the direct farm marketing or direct to consumer aspect. But again, it's maybe another useful tool for you. So just cognizant of time, so we have some time at the end if anybody has any questions. So some resources available to you. So again, there's publication 61, that's Starting a Farm in Ontario, that's by OMAFRA. There's also a business information bundle available to you as well. Those links are on your screen there. Something else, because I mentioned that when it comes to financing, there's not as many options for direct-to-consumer or direct farm marketing farmers compared to the more commodity specific. So there's a program called AgPal, A-G-P-A-L. It's a program that's ran by Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada, so the federal government. And quite literally, you can put in what province you're from or what province you want to focus on, what type of commodities, or you can search. And quite literally, it's a giant database of all the programs that are available, cost share, resources, etc. I find it a very useful tool, especially for a new farmer. So take the time, go to agpal.ca and I start typing in searches for that affect your operation. So if it's direct farm marketing, or if you want to look at livestock or cattle or fruits and vegetables, apples, whatever, that's a good useful tool for people to take a look at. We talked a lot about public health authorities and the local health authorities in your situation. So not too sure where everybody's from, but what part of the province. But if you're looking for what public health authority is in your area, go to the link on your screen there, and that will outline whatever counties are covered by that public health authority. So like if you live in Grey Bruce, Ontario, it is Grey Bruce Public Health. But I think it's then goes to like here in Perth and Wellington, Dufferin. So this is a good tool. So if you are looking at any sort of food processing or food handling aspects of your operation, this is a good starting point to figure out who you need to talk to and get those different resources. Also too, this is through Grey Bruce Public Health, but they do have a fact sheet on how to start a home-based food business. I realize there's a typo on the screen there. It should be home, not hone. But it's about a 2 or 3 page document that just gives you the very quick aspects of starting a food-based business at home. Again, be more so into the food processing aspects of things, but still, I think it's still a valuable tool, useful tool that you can use to assess what you need to focus on and how your operation is going to play out. So in summary, we're at the end. So entering this industry is a daunting task. So if it's, grain, or if it's crops or livestock, or if you're looking at that direct to farm consumer, it is pretty daunting. But like everything else, do your research, especially when it comes to food processing, because there's a lot of rules and regulations that you have to follow. So reach out to public health. I said that a few times tonight. So nudge, nudge, wink, wink. Reach out to public health to understand what roles you have to play and what rules you have to follow. Make sure that you have a written business plan in place, and that includes, financing, marketing, production, processing. Have all those plans in place and do it before you get started, because ultimately, having that written down gives you a better idea of how to go forward with your operation. Also make sure you take the time to determine what is your best option to sell. We talked about 5 different ways that you could sell your produce, your products. Each one has their pros and cons. Make sure you take the time and see what is best suited for you. Maybe it's a combination of a couple. Maybe you need to just focus on one. It really depends. So just take the time, figure out what you feel comfortable with, what you're willing to follow through on. Also, too, like everything else, make sure you leave yourself enough time to obtain financing. Again, if you're looking at food processing, there's a lot of balls in the air that you have to juggle, and make sure that you have financing figured out so that you can, once you get started, you can keep on going and not have to stop because you ran out of money, right? So just keep that in mind. And as I said a few times tonight, use your advisors. That's your accountants, your lawyers, your lenders. There's coaching or coaches out there. There's specific advisors that will hold your hand and walk you through the different aspects of starting a farm in Ontario, your food processing as well. Also, too, find mentors, find neighbors, find other people that are into the world that you want to get into, because they will be able to tell you, what's the hurdles you have to jump over, what are some of the pitfalls that they have maybe fallen into, and so that you maybe not have to repeat that same mistake. So make sure you you reach out, take the time, and figure out what resources there are out there. And when I refer to resources, I talk about fact sheets, info sheets, but then also people. With that being said, I think we're just right in the nick of time. I hope you found this interesting, informative. If you have any questions, I realize we're getting 4 minutes left. Ask away now, put it in the chat, unmute if you so need, or if you don't feel comfortable, no pressure. You can reach out to Lori or Emily at Grey Egg Services for your question. You can reach out to myself. My contact information is on your screen there. And yeah, thank you very much. Thank you for listening. Thank you for sticking to it. And if you have any questions, fire away.